Well, I'm greatly concerned, Damien. I mean, they like to think that things are going to get better. I mean, it's hard to imagine them getting worse than they are at the moment. But we've got this shock, we've got this disruption that is like nothing we've ever seen before, and we've got some state economies being absolutely hammered at the moment because of the lockdowns. We've got some other state economies that are doing reasonably well. WA in particular, I think a lot of the policy responses have been terrible, and we've imposed more costs on ourselves than we should. But we could actually recover quite well if we do end these policies reasonably soon. The problem's going to be if we just keep these policies going and we have more business closures, so more failures. People aren't allowed to travel over Christmas, so all of those tourism businesses that are relying upon that travel, they failed and there's no support for them. I mean, the federal government, it can't keep assisting these businesses forever.
G'day and welcome to episode 68 of The Other Side Australia, your regular dose of sanity from a sensible, classical liberal centre-right perspective. Just a little housekeeping before we dive in today. I want to give a shout out to everyone who sent me encouraging emails and posts lately. We will keep producing this show as long as it continues to grow and serve, and we are really pleased with the big growth that we've had. Please keep on liking and sharing the show with friends. After a year of no income, we still don't want to have to ask our viewers directly for money, but we now know we have a big enough Australian-focused audience for this show to be a very good option for an advertiser without any charity required. So we will be taking that route first, and we're now looking for a major sponsor or two. So if you're interested or know somebody who might be, do get in touch. Our email is theothersideost@gmail.com. It's on the screen now. And that's the same email to use if you'd like to request the link to join our VIP WhatsApp group. The WhatsApp group is not a chat group. It's a one-way group on which we send out the links to the show every week. And of course, you can also sign up on the Discernible platform at discernible.io. That's also on the screen. Coming up in the show in a moment, our intrepid economist Gene Tunney will be on to explain why we seem to be hearing all this economic good news lately, despite the fact that certain sectors of our economy, especially small business, are really hurting. If you want the truth about where the economy may be headed without the political spin or the investment spin, stay with us for a podcast-length deep dive with Gene Tunney in a moment. Well, the left have been screaming for a federal ICAC, Independent Commission Against Corruption, a lot over the past few years, as if it'll bring down corruption on the coalition side of politics and will leave the holy ALP side untouched. Yeah, right. Each state has a different kind of corruption watchdog at the moment. New South Wales is based on the Hong Kong ICAC model and was set up by Premier Nick Greiner in the late 1980s. And it promptly took him down in the early 1990s. The question of whether the ICAC is too tough and too powerful is debatable. As much as I liked Gladys Berejiklian until she went all Dan Andrews on us briefly there with the COVID lockdowns and policing, if you look at what they're investigating her for, it is hard to argue that it's unreasonable that an investigation should be carried out. The problem with these corruption watchdogs is the fact that they move so slowly. And that is bad, because someone who's accused can have their whole career screwed up, like Gladys, and then if they're found to be not guilty later, it's tough luck. And then there's what it does to their reputations. But why should we give a stuff? Well, it means that a lot of good people will not run for politics in our country, especially when you've got to foot your own legal bills in defence. Or in the case of Christian Porter, if you get someone else to foot your legal bills, then there's all sorts of claims that you may owe them one later, so conflicts of interest. And if you make it a blind trust that holds the donations like Porter did so that he doesn't know who's making the donations, supposedly, then it's still not okay because that then lacks transparency. Now, I personally think corruption watchdogs are okay, but they've got to be overseen by an all-party parliamentary committee. ICAC is, and most of the ones, I think all of them in all states are. So ultimately, it is the Parliament, as representatives of the people, us, that they're accountable to at the end of the day. Now, I think ICAC is far from perfect, and we must do something about the reputation and career damage to the accused before they've had their day in court. Otherwise, the old reversal of the presumption of innocence argument is valid somewhat. You're supposed to be innocent until proven guilty and not suffer consequences just based on your accusations before you've had your day in court. I'm also not a supporter of the idea that you must stand aside while you're being investigated. The onus is on the corruption watchdogs to move fast and get the investigations over and done with. Justice delayed is justice denied, or worse, creates injustice. In any case, our Prime Minister has made it clear this week on Channel 7 Sunrise program that we won't be having a federal ICAC anytime soon, leaving Kochie in no doubt about his position on the matter.
Oh, look, it's certainly not a model that we'd ever consider at a federal level, and I think that's been on display for some time. And, you've got to have processes that assume people are innocent before they're thought to be guilty, and that is a real problem. So it's not a model that we've ever contemplated going at a federal level. And, we have a set of arrangements at a federal level that can be built upon, but certainly not going down that path in New South Wales. And I'm sure there are millions of people who've seen what's happened to Gladys Berejiklian and will understand that that's a pretty good call not to follow that model.
As I said, I think in this case it's fair for ICAC to investigate what Gladys did or didn't do and know. But we all lose when good leaders have to step down during these investigations. As for the left's call for a federal ICAC, if it's forced to be fast, it has time limits on investigations, and if it has good parliamentary oversight, and if we stop expecting ministers to stand aside while they're under investigation, then I think corruption watchdogs are a good thing. The problem we have, though, is that a lot of our legal professionals these days, especially those who work in government and criminal justice, tend to be of a bit of a left-wing persuasion. Therefore, the appointment of top lawyers and investigators should be for very short terms and be left to a full parliamentary vote with rigorous public debate. And please don't tell me that lawyers are above imposing their own political views in their work. They're just as bad as journalists, just slightly better educated. As we lurch towards the plan to reopen at a snail's pace because of our woefully disorganised health systems and hospitals management by state governments, and the fact that Australians have wrongly been conditioned to think that COVID deaths are avoidable eternally by an almost 2-year lie that's caused immense suffering to families and small business, I couldn't help but notice this from one of my favourite TV talking head celebrities, Waleed on the ABC's Sunday morning The Insiders show a couple of weeks back.
I think more maddening aspects of our pandemic politics is that we watched leader after leader get up and say, we're just following the health advice. And we as a country have said, that's great, that's exactly what you should do. But actually, that's not the job of a politician. The politician's job is not to follow health advice. Their job is to take health advice, consider it, place it in its proper context with a whole suite of other imperatives that are non-health imperatives as well as health imperatives, and then come to a decision.
Wow. Finally, one of these mainstream media talking heads gets it. I've been saying the same thing on this show for more than a year now. Here's what we said back in early February, 8 months ago. When you're making decisions in a crisis, there are two things you must not do. First, you must not abdicate responsibility to just one group of your advisors. It's not okay to say, I am following the medical advice, or I'm doing whatever the C.H.O. or CMO says. You should heavily weight what they say in your decision making, but you have more to do than just that. You need to think big picture and not be swayed by the emotionality of the moment. You must get advice from other experts, put it all together, and make a decision based on all of the advice. The second thing you mustn't do in a crisis is let politics come into your decision making in any way, shape or form. Do the right and responsible thing, and the politics should look after itself. So despite how scary COVID-19 is and the reality of the world's worst affected large country, the UK, I don't think that we need to be as overcautious and do more harm than good as our leaders in Australia seem to be doing now. This is just too much. We have one case in WA. We know how they got it, and the chance of community transmission is very, very small. We can't let our leaders lock down an entire city over that. It's insane. How can thinking Labor supporters not be completely mortified at what they're seeing their premiers doing? Labor used to stand for civil liberties and freedom and justice, and now it stands for big government and centralised state control. It's not the party of the little guy or the battler anymore. It's the party of the new bureaucratic woke elites. So there you go. I hope Waleed Ali watches this show and that the next time he doesn't take 8 months to catch on. But thanks for catching on.
Let me paint another ridiculous scenario. You could have 0 deaths and 0 hospitalisations by a permanent lockdown. No one thinks that's a good idea.
Indeed.
Now, there is a health argument for that, but it becomes a bad idea because you consider other factors, right? So I guess the thing is, the health advice is not policy advice. What health advisors should be doing, and do, is say, here are the outcomes if you do this. Here's what will happen if you do that, we think. This is the best advice we can give. And then it is up to politicians to decide what consequences they are prepared to live with on behalf of the people. There is no health advice that can give you an answer on what an acceptable level of death, or particularly death, an acceptable level of death is. That's not a health advice question. That's a political and ethical question. Yeah. What the leader has to do is take the advice very seriously that says our hospitals will be overrun. Okay, is that or is that not an acceptable outcome?
And here's what we're going to do about it.
And then we make a decision.
That's Waleed Ali on the ABC's Insiders there. If you'd like to hear more about what we were saying about COVID months ago, I'd recommend episode 41 of The Other Side from June this year. Here's some of what we said then about where we're almost at now. Let's get a little perspective by comparing these fatality numbers with other diseases in Australia over your typical 18-month period. Okay, it's 18 months that we've been living with this COVID-19 crisis. Number 1, heart disease. In the last 18 months, 30,000 people would have died from heart disease in Australia. Number 2, dementia or Alzheimer's, 21,000. Number 3, stroke and clots, 15,000. Number 4, lung cancer, 12,800. And emphysema and other pulmonary diseases, 11,500. They are the top 5 killers in this country. By the way, flu and pneumonia comes in at number 8 at 4,500 deaths, and sadly, suicide comes in at number 9 at 4,500 deaths. That's over any typical 18-month period. If you just add up those 7 major causes on the screen, you get 100,000 deaths. There's about 25 million people in this country, which means your chance of dying of one of those things is 1 in 250 in any 18-month period. And I've left out causes number 6, 7, and 10 for brevity's sake. So just on the 7 on the screen, your chance of dying in the past 18 months was 1 in 250. But your chance of dying of COVID if you're under 80 was less than 1 in a million in Australia. Let that sink in. Okay, now this is the point where most fearful people will jump up and say, yes, but look at India, look at Europe. We're so lucky and we don't want to be like them. And Anastasia and Dan and Mark have kept us safe. So let's just do exactly that, shall we? Let's look at Europe. Let's look at Spain, because it's pretty high up the list of badly affected countries. Many more deaths per million people than in India. And it's also the country that my friend I was telling you about before has just returned from. The COVID cases, the total COVID cases in Spain are at 3.7 million. The total number of deaths is at 80,500. And the country has a population of 47 million, which is just a few million under double that of Australia. So that means the infection rate in Spain is at least 7.5%. The chance of dying of COVID if you're infected is about 1 in 45, which is pretty much the same as everywhere else in the world. And the chance of you dying of COVID at all, as just a normal Spanish person, is 1 in 583. So even if we opened the floodgates to the rest of the world tomorrow, given we now have 5 million Australians vaccinated with their first dose, and we have excellent treatment capabilities, we would be very unlikely to come anywhere near that 1 in 583. In fact, I'd be surprised if COVID could kill more than 1 in 5,000 people in Australia. Very surprised. But I think the most important thing is that we have to learn to grow up, Australia. This should be a teaching moment for us as a nation. We've got to stop this lunatic game of thinking that we can escape COVID if we keep our borders closed. We cannot. First of all, we can't close our borders. We can't afford it economically. And more importantly, we can't keep international Aussies from coming home or leaving the country freely for very much longer. And we can't keep putting them in COVID jail for 2 weeks anymore. We simply have to open up. So I hope you understand what I'm saying there. It's not an opinion I'm expressing. It's just a statement of fact. We have to open up, which means we have to prepare for COVID deaths. Just like we have 3,000 flu deaths every year, and we don't see them tallied up on television every single night, we're probably going to have 3,000 or more COVID deaths. Just like we have 15,000 heart disease deaths a year or 8,000 lung cancer deaths every year. So we really have to stop this ridiculous media coverage of every single positive test and calling cases, positive test results cases. That from our episode 41 in June. And another more recent one to check out for a COVID wrap is episode 57, Locked Up Nation. We hope you enjoy them. Now on to other things. So we keep hearing that the Australian economy seems to be doing okay despite COVID, which seems to be quite surprising to me. So I wanted to get to the bottom of that. Thought we'd invite on once again our economics expert, Jean Tunney from Adept Economics. Jean, thank you very much for taking the time to join us once again on the other side.
Pleasure, Damian. Really enjoy participating in these conversations and also watching your show. So good to be back.
Good to have you here. So, Jean, what's going on? Why are we hearing that the economy is doing okay, despite the fact that, you know, it doesn't really feel like it, especially for a lot of small businesses?
Well, it depends on what period of time you're talking about, Damian. So this came into the news last week because we had the announcement of the final budget outcome. So the Treasury crunched the numbers on what the budget was, ultimately the final budget outcome in the 2021 financial year. And instead of being $161 billion in deficit, it was only $134 billion in deficit, right? So still...
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So when we say, you know, things are not as bad as we thought, it's as opposed to being a complete and utter disaster.
Well, yeah.
Complete disaster.
Yeah. So the Treasury attributed this to the due to the stronger than expected economic recovery. So the recovery from the initial shock from the pandemic and all of the lockdowns last year, that was much stronger than expected. So economists and certainly the Treasury were surprised that the winding down, ending JobKeeper didn't have the big impact, the big adverse impact they expected. People were talking about an insolvency tsunami.
Yeah.
They were talking about jobs, like huge amounts of jobs lost. And certainly I was concerned about that. Basically, we had growth, whereas the Treasury was essentially expecting the economy not to grow.
Yeah, so the GDP went up. We weren't expecting it to go up. So that was a bit of a surprise. So how did that happen, do you reckon?
Well, I think it's because of that amount of stimulus that was provided really was, hugely overcompensated households for the economic shock of COVID. And so there's all this additional money in the economy. So, and there's also all this additional money because people have been borrowing huge amounts to invest in housing, and that's supporting the people in property, and it's been encouraging building activity.
Let's just look at this chart on money supply, which is it's kind of a weird concept for a lot of people to understand. But the the M3, it's called, which basically, just in simple terms, it's how much money's sloshing around in the economy.
Well, it's not what's sloshing around, because it's a stock. Okay, it's the total amount. If you take a snapshot, okay, what's the amount that is either in currency, so notes and coins, which is the smaller part of it, or in bank accounts of the public? Right. What's that total amount?
Okay, so it's the amount of money that's sitting there, liquid, ready to be invested. That isn't.
That's the idea.
Doesn't include anything that's like the money you've got in a house or the money you've invested in stocks or anything.
No, that's right. So stocks are another type of asset. I mean, money's an asset you can hold. So this is the money supply. And it's right to talk about liquidity, because what you're trying to get a sense of with these statistics is just what's the amount of liquidity in the economy that is available to be used, and which could be used to invest or to buy goods and services. Yes.
To explain liquidity, just think of it's just what money's available to just go now and be to buy something with. So it's like cash or money you've got in the bank, basically, is the M3, right? Yeah,
that's the idea. So one of the extraordinary things we've seen is because of the quantitative easing measures, because of the growth in credit, the expansion of credit due to that we've seen with the housing boom, we've had this massive increase in the money supply to over $2.5 trillion. So that's $2,500 billion, right? So it's and that's grown from about 2.2 trillion before the pandemic. So we've seen this big step up in the money supply. Now, this additional money is potentially available to spend, and this is what gives many economists confidence that once the lockdowns end, then there can be another strong rebound from that downturn, because there's no doubt that in New South Wales and Victoria at the moment that they've been smashed by this latest round of lockdowns. I've got some charts that I sent you that you can put up later on that.
So you want to look at retail trade? Or?
Yeah. So if you just look at retail trade, that came out the other week. Yeah, if you look at that dark blue line, I think that's New South Wales, isn't it?
I'm having trouble telling the dark blue from the black. That's the dark blue.
Oh, right. Yeah. That'll be New South Wales. The ones that have been smashed the most are New South Wales and Victoria.
Yeah.
And so we're talking
the blue one and the green one's New South Wales.
Yeah. And so we're talking, what's that? Nearly 15% drop in retail trade. Okay. Wow. So it's certainly, those lockdowns have certainly had a big impact on those state economies, New South Wales and Victoria. And it's had an impact on hours worked and jobs. We've seen the number of payroll jobs in New South Wales, so that's fallen. I think I've got a chart of that too.
Payroll's a bit better indicated than unemployment data, right? Because the Australian definition of unemployment and the unemployment data is someone who's looking for a job, but if you work just 1 or 2 hours a week, you're not considered unemployed. So if you're not looking because you're expecting your job to return. Okay, so the unemployment rate in Australia was 4.5% in August 2021. Okay, like how can that be if we've got state economies locked down and we've got all of these people not working particularly in Western Sydney? Well, it's because those people, they're not being picked up in the payroll jobs data. They're not getting paid, and their hours worked have been massively reduced. I mean, in many cases to zero, right? But because they're expecting the economy to reopen and they're on government benefits, they're not looking for work, so they're not showing up as unemployed. So the definition of someone who's unemployed is that you're actively seeking employment. Yeah, okay, so the green line here on the payroll data is New South Wales.
Yeah.
But a lot of the other states don't look too bad. I'm quite surprised by the orange one. The orange one is Western Australia.
Yeah. I mean, WA and also Queensland was doing has been doing okay. So, I mean, I've spent several years being critical of how the Queensland economy was performing, but I mean, we've actually done better than the rest of Australia doing during COVID, and I mean, because we haven't had to we haven't had as many lockdowns as New South Wales and Victoria.
So I don't get it. Why? How can that be? How can there be just as many jobs around, given the number of small business closures we've seen and stuff?
Well, I think this is relating to this point that we've been discussing about how there was all this additional assistance in the economy. There's all this additional money that's out there because of, well, the assistance, because of quantitative easing, because of bank lending. So we've got a reallocation.
It's the we're not all in this together thing, right? Some people are
exactly
really hard and, and some aren't. Okay. So, Dean, what do you think's going to happen when it's over, more or less, or we start opening up again? Are we going to see some sort of correction or shift happening then, or is this trend pretty indicative of where we're heading? It's not as serious from a payroll data perspective or employment perspective overall.
Well, Damian, I think we don't know how we're going to get out of this, right? I think that's the great unknown. So, I mean, if we ended the lockdowns this month, if we end the lockdowns in New South Wales and Victoria, and Queensland doesn't go into lockdown, then I might think that, okay, we'll bounce back. I mean, there's certainly been people who've suffered, and there's been all the social dislocation. And look, I think we've chatted before. I've chatted with Matt about how I think a lot of the policy response has been terrible, and we've imposed more costs on ourselves than we should. But we could actually recover quite well if we do end these policies reasonably soon. The problem's going to be if we just keep these policies going and we have more business closures, so more failures. People aren't allowed to travel over Christmas, so all of those tourism businesses that are relying upon that travel, they failed, and there's no support for them. I mean, the federal government, it can't keep assisting these businesses forever. That could be a problem, right?
Yep.
Now, but I've got to admit, I mean, some tourism businesses have been thriving, particularly in regional areas. Well, say in Queensland, there are stories about businesses near Carnarvon Gorge, or people are travelling within their own states, and they're going to places they never would have before, or very rarely. And so there are businesses that are booming, and they're talking about staff shortages. So it's this whole thing about how we're not in it together. Some suburban businesses are booming because people are working from home. So you've got cafes in high streets in suburbs that are doing well. Well, in Brisbane, not in Sydney or Melbourne, because they're all shut down, except for takeaway possibly. So yeah, you're right. We're not all in it together.
So how do you feel overall? What's your sort of prediction or feeling as someone who's worked in the Federal Treasury? How do you feel about where we're headed?
Well, I'm greatly concerned, Damian. I mean, I like to think that things are going to get better. I mean, it's hard to imagine them getting worse than they are at the moment. But we've got this shock. We've got this disruption that is like nothing we've ever seen before. And we've got some state economies being absolutely hammered at the moment because of the lockdowns. We've got some other state economies that are doing reasonably well, WA in particular. And Queensland's, it's managed to stay out of lockdown. Who knows how much longer? We're recording this on Monday morning, the 4th. So let's just see how long that lasts. And we've got we've got the property market that's been booming in so much that the government will have to. It's looking at, well, how can we constrain this? Because the Reserve Bank said, that's not our problem. We'll handball that to APRA, to the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority. So they're going to look at so-called macro-prudential measures to try to restrain the amount of lending that's occurring.
That basically just means regulating the banks so they can't lend to investors quite so easily. That stops the market going crazy by saying to investors, well, the interest rate's going to have to be this little bit higher, or you're only going to be able to borrow this amount of the value of the property. and other sorts of restrictions, or you got to demonstrate that you have, enough income. It's probably the most important one.
Yeah. That's exactly right. So I don't think that's the first best way to do it. I mean, I think it makes sense for the Reserve Bank to think about the consequences of its extremely loose monetary policy. I mean, this is a great experiment, right? I think we may have chatted about this before. There's this huge experiment that's been occurring in the advanced economies where we've used this extremely unconventional monetary policy, this quantitative easing, to help support GDP, and they haven't seen any. Well, they thought they could get away with it because CPI inflation has been so low. Now that's starting to increase in some other advanced economies, and so now there are concerns that we could have this huge bout of inflation. So that's one thing that's starting to worry.
And the message for people on that is do not borrow at a level based on today's interest rates. Make sure when you borrow money, you're thinking about how you're going to be able to afford to pay it back when interest rates hit 6, 8, 10, 12%, right? Prepare, be ready, have a buffer, because that could be where we're heading.
Exactly. Because the banks, I mean, they want to write you a bigger mortgage, don't they? They want to lend you more money because they make more money out of you. So they're thinking of, unfortunately, they're not taking that long term. Or well, I shouldn't say that; I might get sued. But they may not be taking into account just the future risks. I mean, it's possible that there could be a lot of people that do borrow too much and get into trouble if interest rates increase in the future. Now, at the moment, you look at what they are, and they're at these massively historical lows. You think, oh well, that's nothing to worry about. But I mean, you and I would remember the late 80s and what was it, 1990, when interest rates were up around 17 or 18%, and it was brutal. Very brutal. I'm not forecasting they'll get to that, but you do have to think there are alternative states of the world that you may not be prepared for. And you should think
I wouldn't
about
borrow at a level that I couldn't repay if it was 10%. So I think that's just as a rule of thumb, that would be my cautious advice. Not that I'm giving any advice; I'm not qualified to formally. Okay, so we've got this boom in the housing market, which can sort of be explained by the fear of missing out. The fear of, especially in places like Brisbane, which are going nuts because everyone's trying to get out of Victoria and moving north, or a lot of people are. And so, Brisbane house prices have taken a hike, but we're seeing house prices going up by more percentage-wise in Sydney and Melbourne. It's kind of kooky. That's coming out of the original perceived thing that a lot of people are going to move to Australia from overseas, and that would bring up Sydney and Melbourne's house prices. And then that feeding a domestic concern and FOMO, right? The fear of missing out.
Yeah.
So then people want to get into the market or get their house as quick as they can. Yeah.
Well, we've seen about 500,000 Australians have returned from overseas. That's one estimate of the number of
the
people.
expats will be coming home. If they know that they can't get in and out freely, then they're either going to make a decision to stay in another country and get, like I'm just saying this as a former expat, you'll either make a decision, okay, we're going to stay in the UK or the US, or Hong Kong or Singapore or wherever we are, or we're going to come home, and then we're going to be looking for jobs, and that's going to mean that export industry, which is what expats are. I mean, they're basically an Australian export industry of managerial talent. We don't have that managerial talent demand in Australia. So experts, so anybody who's got a degree in certain fields where they have to go overseas to earn a buck, they're going to come home, they're going to retire, semi-retire, go into other things, tone down their lifestyle. That's going to stop the flow of money coming into the country from overseas. I mean, it's a serious issue, and there's a lot of them. Australia has a massive overseas working population. It's almost 1 million, 4% of our population. So interesting.
And we've lost many of those people. Are you talking about our diaspora or the temporary migrants in Australia? I mean, one of the issues we've had in Australia recently is a lot of people have gone home to their countries who were here, and that's why some industries such as agriculture and also tourism, they're saying, well, we don't have the skilled people to do the jobs that we once did. So that it's just been such an extraordinary disruption, what we've seen, which makes it very difficult to know what's next.
Yeah, it does. Well, these decisions about borders and closure of international borders are massive decisions that have just been taken like that at a whim, with very little public debate. And most Aussies, when you got politicians appealing to the masses, it's basically, well, just shut it down, because it's not. I can't see how that's going to affect me today. When in actual fact, boy, is it going to affect people, because we are going to see this flight of talent out of Australia in terms of the international foreign, people that we've got working here, and we're going to see expats coming home or not coming home. Probably more to the point, because they are going to go seeking passports from another country that's more free.
Yeah,
that's not going to restrict their movement. So they have a house, a base. Anyway,
Damian, one point I thought would be worth making is that just another factor that meant that the economic recovery from COVID, the first set of restrictions was so strong, was because Australians spend more overseas on holidays and business travel or whatever than foreigners spent in Australia. There was actually, I think it was about $20 billion of a tourism trade services deficit. And what ended up happening was that was redirected to spending within Australia.
Yeah.
Now, what's going to happen is we open up the international border, we will start spending money overseas again. And we won't be getting as much coming in from foreigners, particularly if we're not letting them in. So that's something that may start to affect the domestic economy to some extent.
Well, there's massive pent-up demand to go and have a holiday overseas. There's also massive pent-up demand to go and see relatives and friends.
Exactly.
More to the point. There's also a lot of anger towards the closure. And so people are going to be more wanting to punish and get out. I know that's my feeling. And I think that there's going to be a great reluctance for international tourists to want to come here because they've seen, we've been getting a pretty bad rap internationally for the last few weeks, especially with our police state approach to things in Melbourne. You think that's not going to have an impact on our reputation abroad? My God. I mean,
it does look pretty, it does look pretty crazy.
Bustling away. Right, I can't wait to get down for my Aussie holiday now, mate. No way are they going to want to come down. So, I think we've stuffed that one big time. We'll see what happens. But anyway, so sorry, Gene, you can make your point. And I want to talk about the share market.
Go ahead.
That's the only thing we haven't talked about is the share market yet. Just want to wrap that up and then, but go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say that, one of the big sources of tourism in a way was international students, and it's going to take a while for that to build up again because what we've got is we've lost the so-called pipeline. So that's going to be a concern because we haven't had the people in the first year who'll stay for the second year and then the third year, if you know what I mean. So we'll have to start from scratch again with that. So that might take a while to get back to up to where it was.
Well, I think at the moment we've got for other reasons, to defense security reasons, we have to reduce the number of mainland Chinese students. But we could have been out there saying, okay, we can take more Taiwanese, we can take more Hong Kong Chinese, we can take more Japanese kids, more Filipino kids, more Indonesian kids, whatever, from all of our regional allied nations to balance that out. And that's something that will take a little while to get going too. We've got that double whammy there of the COVID impact, but also the China security impact on that sector, which is a big sector, right? It's a big export industry for us, that education sector.
Okay, I hadn't thought of that as impacting that to a large extent. Clearly you'd be concerned about some people studying postgraduate degrees if they were in sensitive areas. I can see why that would be a concern. I hadn't thought about that concern impacting on the intake.
Undergrad.
Yeah.
Maybe not. Well, I suppose
I'll have to look into it. No, I'll have to look into it. Who knows?
Younger the better.
Yeah.
But I think China's going to be withholding a lot of students as well. So it'll be coming from both sides. But I think we just need to look at the markets that, like India and other parts of the region where we can certainly, where we don't have, there may not be an intelligence risk. But I think that is going to be something that the government's going to be looking at. Yeah. So
Oh, for sure.
share market, my friend, what is going on there? So we've got the housing market booming and the share market having a bit of a, well, it's not really the dive that we think it is, right? It's just a bit of a dip, really.
Well, everyone is concerned about this Evergrande company, this property development company in China that is in its death throes, really. So everyone's concerned that it's going to go bust, and that could have flow-on impacts within China, and then what they call contagion around the region. So everyone's worried about the stability of the financial system in China, and then what that could mean regionally. So that still has to play out. Well, it's not clear exactly just how bad that can be. Who knows? It's so hard to forecast this stuff. I hope it's not the Asian Lehman Brothers. But look, let's just wait and see what goes on. So the markets have been a bit jittery over that, what's going on with Evergrande.
Just sort of background on this. I mean, people have been saying for 20 years that there's going to have to be some big correction in the China market because the property development thing has been pushed along too much in a sort of a fake way, and by the government and by quantitative easing and by all sorts of over enthusiastic build it and they will come philosophies. And so, at one point we're going to see one big Chinese developer who's going to get themselves into trouble with too much debt, and it's going to come apart at the seams, and then that is going to trigger everything else coming apart at the seams.
Yeah. That was a really good summary, Damien. That's based.
For someone who hardly knows what they're talking about.
No, that's essentially what's going on. So yeah, I think that's a good summary.
I just know that from living in Hong Kong that people have been talking about this happening for 20 years. It's like never happened, but this could be it, right? This is the first time we've seen a really big developer cop. And the government's going. What's most important and significant and different about this one is that the government's not saying, we'll step in and fix it. They're saying maybe we need to let this crack. Interesting.
Yeah. I mean, the way I'd look at it, Damien, the way I always look at it is there's a thing in economics called Stein's law, which is if a trend is unsustainable, then it must stop. And I think that's the case with what we see in China. It's just, that there has to be some sort of correction ultimately, but I guess people looked at what was happening before the financial crisis in the late 2000s and saw that there was some unsustainable or some weird things going on, but people just weren't able to pinpoint when things would go wrong or exactly how. But I mean, you look at China and the sort of things that the degree of state intervention there and all of the bad investments that have been occurring, the ghost cities or whatever you call them, and you'd have to sort of wonder just how sustainable this system is, and there's going to have to be some sort of correction, or possibly there'd be a political correction as well one day. But exactly what that'll look like and when it will occur, who knows? Yeah. Very hard to forecast this sort of thing.
It is indeed, my friend. It is indeed. So maybe that share market thing is just a bit of a blip. It'd be nice to see China have its massive correction a little later than just right after COVID, or right still during the tail end of the COVID crisis. But anyway,
I guess another thing that's happened worldwide that's been affecting share markets is there has been concern about the Delta outbreak in some economies too. So that's been another thing that's weighed on the minds of investors. But at the moment, it looks like that it's that Evergrande thing that is that's really making people worried.
All right, Gene, thanks very much. Once again, very comprehensive and great to sort of get your insights and to help me understand things as well. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Damian.
See you again soon. Gene Tunney, our regular economics expert there, economist from Adept Economics.
Hi, this is Damian Coory. If you enjoyed this episode of The Other Side, please like, subscribe, click every button and bell you possibly can on whatever platform you're on, and please tell your friends. That's the number one way you can help us grow. If you'd like to join our VIP WhatsApp group and never miss an episode, because we'll send you a link as soon as they come out, just send us an email first on theothersideost@gmail.com.
asking to opt in, and we'll add you to our VIP group. We'll send you a link so you can add yourself. It's a one-way group, not a chat group, so you won't be bombarded with messages or anything like that. And if you'd like to join the Discernible crew and get all the content from our platform, you can do that at discernable.io. discernable.io.